April 18, 1942, Tokyo. It should not have happened. Everyone in the high command believed the capital was beyond reach, protected by ocean, patrols, and the assumed limits of enemy carriers. Yet bombs fell over industrial districts and near the eastern wards. And the shock was not only in the blast, but in what the blast meant. Sirens cut the air. Smoke threaded the skyline. A faint metallic tang hung on the wind. Citizens ran into streets, shopkeepers shouted, and a radio in a police station kept spitting fragments of an impossible report. Admirals and generals who had never doubted a perimeter now stared at each other as if a private belief had been violated. The Doolittle Raid arrived like a message in a bottle thrown across a sea that everyone thought impenetrable, and that message rewired calculations across an entire command structure. In the hours that followed, a meeting of emergency proportions was summoned, maps were spread, and words that would shape strategy were spoken. But one question haunted the room and the palace alike. Could it happen again? And if so, what part of our strategy would break first? This account will trace the minutes and the mistakes, the warnings and the misread signals, and reveal what commanders truly said when they heard that American bombers had touched Tokyo soil. The sound of the siren remained in the memory of men who thought distance was defense, and that sound is where this story begins. The immediate image was small and precise. Debris in alleys, panes of glass blown inward, the staccato of distant fire, a tang of cordite like cold iron on the tongue, and the low moan of wounded being carried under tarpaulins. Newspapers printed crude sketches of the attacker aircraft. Market vendors counted casualties, while children touched grit on their cheeks. The public morale bent like a reed in sudden wind. On the docks, sailors watched smoke columns from battleships and tried to orient their binoculars to nothing and everything. Police radios carried clipped reports of plane silhouettes, of one engine dying, of pilots bailing out, of a raid that had landed its message more than its ordnance. Photographers such as Kato from the Asahi took trembling frames that later sat next to maps in staff rooms. The smell of burning paper mixed with human sweat in the corridors of power. On the city streets, a bell from a temple kept tolling, a low warning note that seemed to count the nation down. That sensory tableau moved like a current toward the command bunkers and the headquarters where decisions had to be made quickly and in public. If this moment surprised you, you are not alone. If the idea that a handful of medium bombers could reach the capital feels like a small miracle with oversized consequences, pause and think about the choices that followed. What would you do if you were Chief of Naval General Staff Nagano? If you were Admiral Yamamoto? If you were a cryptographer who had just been handed a fragment of enemy signal, what would you tell the Emperor? Would you extend the defensive perimeter or consolidate forces at sea? Type a single word in the comments below to show your instinct. Write defend if you would fortify and hold territory, or write counter if you would seek a bold offensive reply. Your answers help us understand public instincts against military logic and will guide which decision point we investigate next. On top of that, tell us which figure you think bore the moral weight of the decision: Nagano, Yamamoto, Nagumo, or the Emperor. We will read the most interesting takes and return with sources and maps while we continue the narrative. Now, let us step into the room where papers were smoothed and voices were measured. The conference room filled quickly. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto arrived with a coat still damp from rain and a face that had seen rough seas. He set down a leather portfolio. To his left sat Admiral Osami Nagano, the chief who preferred reports to rhetoric. Vice Admiral Chuichi Naguno stood with a forefinger touching a map, as if to steady a trembling. Cryptanalyst Suzuki shuffled papers and pushed a telegram forward. Captain Fuchida, a liaison officer, kept checking a model aircraft on the table. Young Lieutenant Ito, a signals officer, leaned over the radio console. The room smelled of tobacco, paper, and boiled tea. There were 3 short, sharp sounds as a messenger closed the door. A map of the Pacific covered a long table, and pins marked carrier positions, patrol lines, and shipping lanes. Voices were low and taut. Someone spoke the first figures, and the room reacted like a body exposed to cold water. "How many bombers?" Nagano asked, his voice dry. 16 is the initial count, Suzuki said, sliding a report across. He rubbed his nose with the heel of his hand, leaving a faint line of ash on the paper. "From where?" Nagumo demanded, eyes on the map. He tapped at a course marked near the marshals. The tap sounded hollow in the hush. "Launch range would suggest carriers," Fuchida answered. He traced an arc in the air with his finger, and the motion left a tiny comet of light on the map under the electric lamp. "Carriers that close," Yamamoto said, and his tone was not accusation, it was realization. "That should be impossible, given our patrols and their fuel limitations." "Unless they risked fuel and distance," Ito interjected, the young man speaking fast as if to outrun a fear. He smelled faintly of sweat and cheap cologne. "Unless they launched early and accepted losses." "Are we sure this was not a raid staged from a captured island?" Nagano asked. His hand felt the grain of the table. The room heard the scrape. "Surveillance shows no forward base in that area," Suzuki replied, sliding a second document. He spoke with the thin voice of a man who sees patterns. "But our intercepts are incomplete. We have gaps." "Then we must extend patrol ranges," Nagumo said. He folded his hands and lit a cigarette. The smoke curled upward and carried the taste of resolve. "We cannot leave Tokyo exposed." "Extending the perimeter requires carriers and fuel and escorts," Yamamoto answered. "That reduces our offensive options. That trades initiative for protection." "Public morale," Fuchida said quietly. "People will demand action and safety." "Do we sacrifice the fleet to assure the capital?" Nagano asked, and the question hung like a bell. The tactile thud of paper as maps were shifted punctuated the silence. Outside, a distant rumble of traffic seemed to echo the stress in the room. The exchange continued with 6 more sharp turns of argument, advice, and counterpoint, until a consensus of sorts was sketched, not in ink, but in the weight each man placed on his words. The scene held 3 to 4 sensory notes, from the clinking of teacups to the scrape of chair legs and the bitter scent of tobacco. After the meeting, a small delegation was sent to the imperial palace to explain and to answer a single unavoidable question. Emperor Hirohito sat in a low chair in a room lit by a paper lamp. The air smelled of tatami and incense. His voice, when he asked, was soft but carried a severity that made men straighten. "Can Tokyo be protected?" he asked. Prime Minister Tojo waited with his hands clasped. Nagano bowed and gave a measured reply. "With resources shifted, yes, but at the cost of other theaters." Yamamoto looked at the emperor and then at the map. He said, "Your Majesty, if we extend the perimeter, we will dilute our offensive punch. If we hold the fleet, we risk another blow to the homeland." The emperor leaned forward, and the room felt suddenly small and consequential. "Which is the greater risk?" Tojo asked, seeking a moral calculus. "A lost ship or lost faith?" Yamamoto answered. There were 3 exchanges more, as the emperor considered logistics and public morale, as Saito, a naval aide, mentioned coastal defense upgrades, and as Lieutenant Ito detailed patrol timings. The threads of strategy and personal responsibility braided briefly into decision. Orders followed. Ships shifted course. Convoys were reorganized. A plan emerged that prioritized the creation of a wider defensive ring while preparing a major offensive to lure and fix enemy carrier groups. The operational orders named islands to seize and patrol arcs to patrol and carriers to deploy.
Logistics officers like Captain Nakamura and Commander Ogawa were given tight timetables and softer warnings about fuel consumption and escort vulnerability. Sailors like Corporal Tanaka received terse briefs about night patrol patterns, and lookouts were instructed to report unfamiliar silhouettes immediately. The plan was both decisive and desperate because it tried to do the impossible. It attempted to secure both safety and initiative at once. The smell of grease and salt on the docks became the background to nights
of hurried provisioning. What the High Command did not know then, but would learn, was that American signals had been cracked earlier in the spring and that fragments of Japanese plans had informed a counterplay. A team of cryptographers in the United States had worked through codes and patterns and prepared an ambush that turned the extension of a defensive perimeter into a trap. The error was not a single miscalculation, but a compound of fear, logistics, and predictable moves. While officers like Nagumo planned carrier sorties and Nagano calculated fuel allocations, enemy commanders read echoes of Japanese intent and set a different stage. The revelation of code decryption came in quiet cables that were later declassified, but at the time translated into swift repositioning by the adversary. The result was a collision between a nation trying to preserve its capital and an opponent who had positioned foresight where distance was supposed to protect. 1 month later, the effects were both symbolic and material. Coastal batteries had been reinforced, and the public felt a brisker confidence, but the fleet had been strained and certain offensive windows closed. 3 months in, the strain became strategic. Supplies routed to new patrols delayed offensives in other theaters, and Allied forces exploited those gaps. 6 months on, the loss of initiative hardened into a tangible shift in naval balance, as carriers and experienced crews could not be replaced quickly. The moral cost was observed in speeches and in quiet officer rooms where men like Yamamoto and Nagano revisited choices and wondered whether a different balance between risk and restraint might have preserved both reputation and capability. The lesson lingered in the language of the service. Never assume distance is an impregnable shield, and never let fear alone redraw your strategy. As one officer later wrote in a private memorandum quoted by historians, the worst enemy is not the bomber over the city, but the paralysis it induces in those who must decide. In the end, the Doolittle Raid did more than scorch roofs and wake a nation. It forced a recalculation of what was possible and what was assumed. It revealed that a single bold action, though limited in material damage, could unmake certainties and compel choices that reshaped campaigns. The invulnerability that maps once promised was shown to be a brittle thing, and the decisions uttered in that emergency room echoed for months and years. If there is a final thought, it is this: when fear governs strategy, the long view is often the first casualty, and nations pay in ships, men, and the slow erosion of initiative. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to follow deeper dives into the moments where decisions changed wars, and share which command decision you would have made when the sirens first sounded.